Welcome to Breaking Doctrine, presented to you by the Combined Arms Doctrine Directorate at the Combined Arms Center at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. The views expressed here are those of the individual and do not represent the views of the Combined Arms Center, U.S. Army, or U.S. government.
Welcome to Breaking Doctrine, a U.S. Army Combined Arms Center podcast on emerging doctrine and the Army's vision of warfare. Hello, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Nikki Dean, and welcome to another episode of Breaking Doctrine. We have a very timely topic queued up today. It's FM30 and the Army's return to large-scale combat operations. Today we're going to discuss the circumstances that gave us the 2017 edition of FM30 and the shift to large-scale combat operations, or LSCO. This is going to be the first of several episodes of Breaking Doctrine in which we'll take a deeper look at the evolution of operational doctrine from the global war on terror all the way back to the Cold War. And this is a careful balance between maintaining the knowledge we have, adopting lessons we've learned, and then anticipating how we're going to fight in the next conflict. 2017's FM30 wasn't the first FM30 to attempt this, but it's probably our most recent example. We've discussed in previous episodes the review and evolution process is continual. This process of reflection and adaptation also means that we are addressing our Army's roles now and in the future and asking ourselves what it means to conduct multi-domain operations. In other words, the CADD doctrine writers have been deep in the wilderness, thinking and researching and talking with a wider Army and our partners, and ultimately, we're writing a book. And not just any book, it's the book, it's FM30 Operations. So where do you go when you want to know a little bit about what it's like to evolve a body of knowledge while the Army is still conducting operations around the world? Fun fact, you find some soldiers who know about that sort of thing. You find yourself Lieutenant General retired Michael Lundy, the former Commanding General of the Combined Arms Center, Mr. Rich Creed, the Director of Combined Arms Doctrine Directorate here at Fort Leavenworth, and Lieutenant Colonel retired Mike Flynn, a member of the FM30 writing team, who's been a consistent contributor to editions of FM30. And then you ask him to come on your podcast. So, gents, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Nikki.
Thanks.
Good to be here.
So I think it would help to give our listeners, especially a younger crowd, a little bit of background about the Army, and also its doctrine prior to the global war on terror, because there was this period between the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Soviet Union and the events of 9/11. And during this period, the Army was not this dormant entity. It was actually conducting operations and generating lessons, and ultimately it codified them in doctrine. So I'd like to have you guys shed a little bit of light on that post-Cold War, pre-9/11 experience, and also what was informing the Army's body of knowledge overall.
Well, so I'll take that to start, and then because your career and my career overlap significantly, with you obviously been a little bit more on the senior side by a couple of years. But so we commissioned in the Army in 1989. Airland battle was our doctrine. We started the drawdown in Europe, and then we kind of had the one big example of putting airland battle into practice in Operation Desert Storm, with that force that was trained and equipped for that we had essentially grown up in over, depending on what generation you were, for a few years or even a decade or more. But after that, the rest of your experiences, formative experiences as company grade officers in the 1990s, were doing those real-world contingencies in places like the Balkans, Somalia, Haiti, and so forth. And so the Army, while it continued to train against the large-scale combat operations threat at the combat training centers and MCTP warfighters, your practical experiences in the field and conducting operations were something less than large-scale combat operations. So the skill sets you had were valuable in terms of command and control and forces and discipline and those kinds of things. But the doctrine really didn't account for that, because airland battle was really all about defeating the Warsaw Pact and, to a lesser extent, North Korea. And so over time, and about the time that I got to CGSC in the School of Advanced Military Studies here at Leavenworth, we came out with a new 3.0 or new 100-5, and we changed the numerology to align with joint doctrine, so it went from 100 series books to 3 series books. And that's where, you got to this idea of full spectrum operations. In other words, the Army does win those. We do big fights, we do small fights, we do peacekeeping, we do security force assistance, we do all of these kinds of things. And the doctrine was informed by lessons that really started in the 93 100-5 when they talked about military operations other than war, right? But that never really caught on because the acronym was MOOTWA, and it made you sound like you were doing some sort of weird college cheer, right? And so that being said, the content of the doctrine was pretty good, and it did help the forces during the 90s, but the full spectrum operations seemed to capture the big idea. I don't know, sir, if that's was your experience or not.
No, I agree, and I think, where the National Command Authority was focused, what were the interests of the nation at the time, and as the Cold War ended, that started to shift, and there was a lot of thinking about, well, what are our national interests? So, our doctrine is also informed by, it's largely informed by the requirements that we have that are set about on the service, on what we need to be able to do for the nation. And so that, I think there was a period of a lack of complete understanding from a national perspective, national interest. I think it became more internalized, and it also became more sympathetic or humanitarian in nature. That we were looking across to make a better global environment. We didn't perceive really any threats to our national interest, but we saw limited threats around the globe. So I think that was a part of that transition piece too. There was not a seminal event really. The seminal event was the collapse of the Soviet Union, and our primary threat that we had built our doctrine around, built our organization around, built our training around, developed our material solutions for. That everybody believed went away, and so we started a transition. And I think there was also the peace dividend that played a pretty significant role in reshaping our armed forces. The fact that we were downsizing in a significant way. I mean, the Army of 1986 that I came into looked very different in the 90s, was much smaller, less capable from a large-scale combat operations, but was refocused to being able to do some of these other tasks. So I think that was the start of a pretty significant period of time that we did not really focus on what were potentially nation-threatening threats that were either in dormancy and going to evolve eventually or come out eventually, or those that were starting to rise and emerge as possible challenges to the nation in the future.
Well, and it gets to the General Perkins thing about what's the Army for, kind of thing, right? So you got to show you're relevant to that changing thing. And I think we benefited, though, and you and I used to talk about this, we coasted on the LSCO culture that we developed in the 70s and 80s.
Right.
Because our training models pretty much stayed the same, unless
Right.
you were doing an MRE, but even in a mission rehearsal exercise for Bosnia or Kosovo, you still had some sort of a combat piece of that, right, to keep everybody's skill up, because your credibility as a peacekeeper came from your ability to kind of...
Well, and I think the complexity of large-scale combat operations, when you develop your leaders to be able to operate in that environment, and your training and your processes that you have, both in the institutional Army and in the operational force, all of those processes, they carry very well into other forms of combat. The reverse is not true, and that's one of the challenges that we saw as, and again, not to get ahead of the discussion, but, is what emerged out of the counterinsurgency limited contingency operations that we became fully embroiled in after 9/11, the level of discipline, training rigor, innovation, initiative, at echelons above really the battalion level, maybe the brigade, that there's not a demand signal for that, and we were more focused on other complex tasks, but they didn't develop the skill sets that we needed to be able to operate in truly a complex environment where it's very contested in large-scale combat. So I think you're right. We were able to coast a bit after the wall fell, after Desert Storm. A lot of the things that we had learned and how we developed our leaders, the rigor that was in our professional military education, the fact that our combat training centers were focused in the right place, they really were what drove change in our Army. And as soon as we really started to adapt the combat training centers more to mission rehearsal type training centers focused on a specific fight, which was either Afghanistan or Iraq, that's where we started to no longer change the Army given the emerging OEs that were out there. And I think that's kind of what led us to the 2017 version.
Well, and that resident skill in the senior company grade, officer NCOs, and then the entire field grade population got you, a successful IF1.
Right.
A successful Fallujah 2004.
Correct.
Our battalion, the battalion I served in as an operations officer, did the last, what they used to call the high intensity rotations at NTC in August of 2003. After that, all of them became focused on mission rehearsal.
Yeah, and the reason they were focused on mission rehearsal was really about dwell time. I mean, we were faced with a real world problem that, a significant amount of our Army was committed to fighting the global war on terror. And so there was nobody that was not being thoughtful about the future, or there was no bad actors there. It was out of necessity. Our Army was much smaller, and the requirements for Army, at times where we had 25 or 30 brigades deployed with some enabling brigades, some types of enabling brigades doing 15-month deployments with 9 months back home and then deploying again. We had to adapt our training to where home station training did not have the rigor that it had previously, because there wasn't time. Because you come back off of a 12, 15-month deployment, you can't put people in the field a month later and expect an all-volunteer Army to survive that. So we adapted our training centers to really fill that niche, and we reduced the requirements to focus on what was most prevalent, because the unit of action largely was, at the company platoon level, some battalion level operations, some brigade level operations, but very minimal, frankly, with the exception of, things like Fallujah. But by and large, we were focused at the small unit level. So that's where we shifted our training to allow us to not burn the force down. So it was out of necessity. There was no ill intention or lack of foresight there, because there was plenty of us realizing and talking about at the time that we're going to have to think about how we recover our ability to fight at echelon when we come out of this global war on terror, which nobody would have predicted at the time lasted 18, 20 years.
I had a quick question to kind of follow up on this, especially given the experience that all three of you had. Was that a frustration to go through this idea of I have a limited amount of time to get after training objectives, and at the same time with R4Gen, the Army Force Generation plan and platform, did it feel like you were being constrained, and did you want to, and did your peers want to actually have a chance to be there and choose training objectives?
No, I think as we got initially, in the early stages, because we were also changing the Army. The structure of the Army was changing. We were modernizing. We were adapting a lot of formations, and we found that we needed to adapt even more formations as we were going along because the requirements were there. But as we completed the transitions of our brigade combat teams, our combat aviation brigades, our artillery battalions and brigades, there were lots of units that were in a significant amount of change. So that change was ongoing. Plus, we're fielding a lot of new equipment. I mean, think about MRAPs and our armored personnel, wheeled vehicles that were coming in, all kinds of jamming equipment to face the IED threat. There were a lot of new things that we're having to bring in to deal with just the problem set of either Iraq or Afghanistan. All of that was going on, so it contributed to this competition for time. So what it forced us to do was really focus our training at the echelon that was at most risk, and commanders had to take risk at where the least amount of risk in the near term. So it forced us into current ops. So we got to have very good platoons and companies that can do a wide range of missions in a counterinsurgency type environment, whether it's local governance to security operations to limited offensive and defensive operations, and that's where we focused a lot of our effort. So, from a frustration perspective, I don't know that, I would say anyone was frustrated because, brigade commanders, division commanders, battalion commanders, company commanders, we knew the mission we were going to have to do. And so were we able to train effectively for that? And the answer is yes. I think that, we were not sending untrained forces to do these missions. But we were only trained to do that mission. And it's just a small subset of what skills and knowledge and abilities you have to be able to fight in large-scale combat. So broadly looking to the future, we could sit back and think about, we're not preparing ourselves for what's next. We didn't have the luxury of time to be able to do that, but we were putting very, very well-trained formations into the counterinsurgency fight. And I think, with the evolution of doctrine and counterinsurgency, a lot of the new equipment that was coming in, we were in a constant evolution of how we were thinking about fighting this. But, we never had more than a platoon at risk in any of this fight. And I think you can look at, how our soldiers and, frankly, across the Joint Force did very, very well for that very narrow spectrum of conflict that we needed to operate in.
Well, and I think the other point too, sir, and this is from how you treat doctrine, right? So the focus of doctrine then was on the current fight and getting it right.
Right.
And so the focus of lessons collection and after action reviews and all of those things that inform, changes to doctrine over time come from that practical experience in the field. But we still had doctrine for the old, the former type of fight that we used to focus on. We just were not focused on. And so you could say it was neglected a little bit. In other words, you may not have had the ability to see, hey, is this stuff still applicable? Should we have to fight in 2020?
Well, the doctrine that we had that was focused on large-scale combat, and I agree, we still had, it had not evolved completely, but there was enough still there. But really, I think to me, the challenge when you're in these kind of fights and this prolonged period of time that we had was the doctrine was not driving the other elements of .mil-PF with respect to that particular part of the continuum.
No, absolutely. Yes.
We adjusted formations to coin. We adjusted material solutions to coin. We repurposed units that were, largely focused, an artillery unit, that's focused on counter battery fire and providing mass fires and support of maneuver. We refocused them to doing, infantry type tasks where they were actually, infantry battalions not taking artillery to the fight because we just didn't have enough combat power to do all of it. So I think that as an Army from a strategic perspective, and again, I don't think there was any lack of foresight. I think it was just a simple fact that, hey, the inbox is really, really full, and what we see on the horizon, we're not seeing a huge emerging threat right now that will force us to have to put another eye towards large-scale combat, and that persisted for some time, at least up until, right after 2010, 2011.
I'd just like to add a little bit to that, General Lundy. Is at the time I was a doctrine writer here, so I started like 2001, and so I joined up in 85, very familiar with the 86 doctrine and the Cold War all the way through that. But then when I became in the doctrine around 2001 timeframe, one of the biggest shifts, I think the 2008 edition of FM30 was as big as a shift as what the 86 or the version before that was. And that's because of everything you just said. There was a change in the situation, and we had to have enough forces to go do operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so when we were here in doctrine, we were working with all the other folks in the Army doing this, and we were working the modular Army, which was a big deal as we were repurposing forces. And it was not foresight, or there was no malice, as you said, but one of the assumptions made was we will not face a peer threat for 15 years. The inbox is full right now. What do we need to do to change our Army and to change our doctrine to get at that problem? And it's interesting, and I don't want to jump ahead, but it's interesting now we're here about 15 years later and the threats we're facing. And that kind of gets us a little bit to why we went to the 2017 edition. But that's just being here as a doctrine guy, that was an insight. And really it was like on the board, like an assumption we will not face a peer threat for 15 years. So
Yeah,
we can go about.
That gets back to taking risk, and a big part of our current doctrine right now is not how we avoid risk or how we become risk averse, but it's, do we take the right risk? And the Army had, the Army Department of Defense, but largely the Army, had to make some decisions about what level of risk could be taken to be able to accomplish the mission that we were given. And history will tell whether we timed it right and we synchronized it right and that we took the right amount of risk for the right amount of time, and then were we able to recover and face the next set of challenges. And that's what we're in right now, is how do we face this next set of challenges. Over the last 5 years, we've been in that transition, that inflection point, to be able to get there.
Well, there's always a lag time between the new doctrine and then it being adopted by everybody, right? Just because you publish it and announce it.
Yeah.
So you remember, because I think you were at CACT when this discussion took place, but the use full spectrum operations that started in 2001 and I think that ran to 2008 before it was Unified Land Operations, Mike, was it?
Full spectrum?
Yeah, full spectrum was still going. So even when we went to the Unified Land Operations, and okay, nobody really cares what you call it. What it encompasses is pretty much, in many cases, very similar to what went before. But do you remember when CT Combat Training Center rotations that were directed to become more focused on
Six lines.
Land combat against peer threats, right?
Yeah.
And everybody used to call them full spectrum operations,
Yeah.
which is exactly the opposite of what the original full
Correct.
spectrum was supposed to mean. The full
Correct.
spectrum before was supposed to be account for all those things other than that high intensity.
And then we went to
large-scale combat.
decisive action.
Right,
So
yeah, decisive action rotation.
people
And-
like bumper stickers.
Right.
You got to be careful about what you put in doctrine, because it could become a bumper sticker and take on a life of its own.
Yeah, someone's looking for a label. So the chief says, stop calling them full spectrum. So, all right, we're going to call them decisive action. And decisive action became a thing, even though it was never intended to be a synonym for the other thing.
And got frequent questions about, okay, explain to me what decisive action is. And we had it double defined in the manual. So it was those are all things that you learn about.
Yes, sir.
So I want to talk about the big green elephant in the room, because some of us were here and remember it. What, if any, role did Doctrine 2015 have in kind of setting conditions or affecting that 2017 push or that 2017 work that began?
I think it was more than just Doctrine 2015. There were a host of things that were decided in between, say, what do you say, Mike, 2010 and 2015 when it was realized and actually finished. The first was, we changed doctrine or the way we approach the doctrine based on lots of inputs, and in some cases, senior leaders get to make the decisive call on that. So there was a vision within TRADOC that said the current way we have doctrine organized and so forth was not effective, and that there was too much redundancy or waste or whatever the words were that were used at the time. And it was too hard to navigate because we basically call everything a field manual. And so there was an idea that in this modern era where you could have searchable databases and so forth, why don't we have a hierarchy that goes from the general to the specific, and that so if you're a generalist, you can go to this level. If you're a specialist, you can get down to this level. And in theory, that makes a lot of sense. But when you, in some cases, what felt like arbitrarily decided what the numbers of these things would be, what would stay or what would go, you ran risks of losing the richness of discussion, as Mike, I think, will expand upon with some detailed examples. But and then you put the entire, in this case, training and doctrine command, doctrine enterprise, and really some of the concepts people, but all the .mil-PF that comes from this, their entire focus is changing the structure of this thing and not the content. You were trying to figure out where to put the content in, and relatively junior people with minimal levels of supervision, because again, there's wars going on here, and you don't always have your full group of people that you should have looking at these kinds of ideas. So people made decisions based on their own best judgment about what stayed and what went so that we could fit it into this construct.
So we ended up with a really good filing system for doctrine, I think. Although we had
surface.
Please, sir.
I
Knowledge
said
management.
filing system. I didn't say what was in the folders. And I think that was, one of the challenges. And I think we had one too many files, so we made the decision when I was here to take one of the files out because, the 10-page, Cliff Notes version became what everybody read, and so we had lots of folks that had really good little bumper sticker elevator speeches, but understanding the intellectual underpinnings behind those little bumper stickers, we found that we didn't have it there. So combining the ADPs and the ADRPs together to bring more of the richness of the discussion and the logic. I mean, we had although we had very good logical connections, if you understood the full body, we didn't have places where it was apparent if you only read, the 10-page ADP. So that was one of the things that I changed I didn't ask permission, and nobody missed it. So I guess I got away with that. But I think it helped, really kind of tie the logic a little better. And then, the focus was how do we take this really good filing system and make sure that the content was right. And I'm not saying that all those manuals had bad content. A lot of them were very, very good, but there were many that, and there were disconnects. There were some, they weren't necessarily as threaded together as well as they are now. And understanding that logical flow through everything, and the taxonomy. There's a taxonomy to doctrine that you kind of have to follow because it helps you frame the ideas that are in there and be able to stitch them together in this logical sequence of very complex things that are happening on multiple time horizons and throughout the entire depth of the operational framework. So.
And it drives you towards redundancy sometimes too. Like, what's the right level of redundancy? So,
Right.
We were doing a session this weweek, and the foreign officers always asked, the British in particular, said, we like your doctrine, but it's really detailed. You guys put an awful lot of stuff, and so they did a word count between their doctrinal publications and ours, and it was an order of magnitude different. And I said, well, one of the reasons why we do that is we think there's a necessary level of redundancy because you don't want people carrying 4 books around with them on the same topic. I mean, you really want staff officers to have, their helmet bag filled with just the things that they need to carry around, no kidding, that you could keep in the bustle rank of the tank or whatever. And so we are, out of necessity, fairly descriptive because we assume that not everybody has done this job before or is familiar with the subject matter, nor do they have time to read the ADP and then the FM before they get to the ATP. I mean, it'd be nice if they did. But.
Yeah, and I think some of that goes back to when you look at some of our doctrine that emerged post-Cold War for a period up to 2000, 2001. We got very checklist focused, and we tried to, MET-T, and this is one of the things that, it was a big thing when I came in, because almost every sentence in doctrine ended with MET-TC dependent. And, I said, well, look, if it is in fact, the operational variable of MET-TC, then maybe we ought to talk about what those variables might be because do we have the experience to understand them? Because what we were finding was, one, some of our soldiers couldn't define MET-T, just didn't know what the acronym was, or how to use that operational, looking at operational variables, mission variables, and being able to contextualize, given that particular, whether it's an attack or a defense or whatever, what potential variables real world would be involved with that. So, we've had to educate. And as the Army's learning again in large-scale combat operations, I think that's helping us think more deeply than just a checklist or you can memorize the acronym for the 3, 4, 5 tenets that are out there, but that's really not the art piece of it, and that's just being able to pass a soldier exam. You got to be able to contextualize it and what it means, in the fight.
So we wanted to, based on your guidance at the time, it was really about making sure people weren't lazy, intellectually lazy.
Yeah, that's exactly the words I used.
Yes, I recall. And I think, so I'm pretty sure nowhere in anything that's been revised since 2016 does it say MET-TC dependent.
Correct.
Because it's all about not farming the burden of understanding what a commander is telling their staffs to do with just hiding it behind an acronym and then saying, go do great things. I need to explain to you what I mean in terms of the mission, the enemy, the troops available, terrain and civil consideration, whatever, in a particular context. Otherwise, you're abrogating your responsibility, right? And so I think we've followed and met your intent.
Let me add just a point on the filing system that General Lundy was talking about. Doctrine 2015 was a pretty good idea, but we had one or two too many files. And I think the good news right now is, as you're seeing doctrine that's going to come out, and I'll just use the topic of planning. So under the Doctrine 2015 series, to understand planning, you had to go to ADP 5.0 to understand the fundamentals. But then you went to another book to understand how to do the MDMP. And then you had to go to an ATP to understand how to do design. And so what we're doing, for example, we're going to release an FM 5.0 out here, which was in 2005, but under Doctrine 2015, we didn't have it. We're about ready to introduce a new FM 5.0 that's going to have Chapter 1, the fundamentals of planning, the MDMP, troop leading procedures, design, the orders format, all in one book. And so now I kind of said disparagingly a little bit that we kind of had to go fish. You had to try to figure out where to go for it. So by eliminating a couple of files, now you got packaged document of the topic. I think that's going to be helpful. And FM 3.0 kind of did that for us as well.
So I think this is kind of a perfect opportunity to get into the 2017 book itself. When I was doing almost a post-mortem research for today's discussion, I was digging back through some articles that came out. And one was a 2018 article out of War on the Rocks. It was a published op-ed from Dave Barno and Nora Ben-Sahel about the U.S. military's dangerous embedded assumptions. And I noticed that 2018, and they stated that they found themselves thinking about how unchallenged assumptions can prove very deadly in wartime, and it led them to wonder, quote, what convictions are so deeply embedded today in the military's planning for the next war that could lead to a catastrophe if proven wrong? Most of the focus was on Air Force and Navy, but one of their questioned assumptions kind of stuck out to me, which is advanced U.S. weapon systems will operate effectively under wartime conditions. And I was like, whoa, funny that, because I know in 2016, this group assembled here was already thinking about that and already building the Army's doctrinal answer. So I'm going to start off straight to you, sir. Like, what was the thing that got you up at night, or what was the midnight phone call? What said, I think it's time for us to refocus the Army on large-scale combat. I'm going to use FM 3.0 as my tool to do so. You are, the doctrine, you are probably one of the most doctrinally passionate GMs I've ever met. But what was that process that said, nope, this is it, we're shifting?
Yeah, when they told me I was going to be the commander of the Combined Arms Center. When I got a call from the Chief of Staff of the Army on a Friday and said, you take command on Monday, I knew what I needed to do when I got here. And that's not to be flippant, but I mean, it had built from, frankly, over many years. And I mean, I think it's just, experience does kind of matter, and our experiences shape who we are and how we think. And as a young lieutenant starting out, in Europe as my first assignment, sitting right across the inter-German border from the 8th Guards Army, and thinking about that problem set of, how am I going to neo my family out of Germany if it goes down, to going to the National Training Center and being an OCT out there, as a captain and a major, and, for 4 years fighting every day against the Black Horse that was, configured as this pure threat, to then having to deploy my brigade and battalion into a counterinsurgency fight, and seeing how different that was, also shaped by Desert Storm. And then I think what really kind of, where I really started to see that we were going to have an issue at the strategic level of the Army probably was my time at JRTC as a senior trainer, where I'd come from the National Training Center as a major, gone off and done battalion command, done a deployment, and then came back as a senior trainer down there, and we had completely moved away from conducting combat training center rotations, and we were doing sticks lanes. We were doing what I expected captains to be doing at home station. We were leading that for units. And again, it was because of no malice. I was seeing units that were very quick. We were standing up new brigades, standing up new battalions. We were reshaping the entire Army, and there was no time to train at home station. So we were having to use our Combat Training Center program, which to me, the Combat Training Centers are what changes, including the Mission Command Training Program. So your National Training Center at Fort Irwin, the Joint Readiness Training Center at Fort Polk, our Joint Multinational Readiness Center, in Hohenfels, and the Mission Command Training Program that focuses on echelons above brigade. Those four things are the stimulus that drives change in our Army. And the thing that drives doctrine in our Army are those four elements. If you do it at the CTC, that crucible event that was for a unit and a commander, that's how you change the Army. You change the Army's behavior because it's experiential learning. It is cause and effect. We do it in PME, but professional military education, if somebody's going to show up into that once every 4 or 5 years, you give them a blast of doctrine. It's not under. There's no cause and effect. That a lot of it's rote, memorization. You're doing some simulation and stuff like that, but it's not the most effective way to change the Army. It really helps enrich the Army. I would say it doesn't change the Army. What changes the Army is, how you write your doctrine, and then how you enforce that doctrine, how you infuse that doctrine through your combat training centers or through combat, which the combat training centers used to replicate very well. And when I came out of JRTC and then went off, took brigade command, and came back out of that and went out to be a division DCG at the 1st Armored Division and took the division out for its first division field exercise, I saw us back to doing the same thing, doing sticks lanes for companies. And the threat was starting to emerge at that time. I mean, you're starting to see Russia, emerging again or trying to reemerge. China is starting to rise. North Korea is certainly very present. Iran was a variable out there. So those four things all presented risks to the nation and risks to us. So as we went in, I got down to the aviation center. I know I'm giving you a long answer, but there wasn't a phone call. I guess it was accumulation of a lot of things. When I got to Rucker, I looked at the aviation doctrine and it was outdated, and it needed to be. And so I wrote the doctrine, but I didn't have anything to write to. I was sending things up here to CADD, and I was in discussions with the CADD dad at that time. And there are things I was putting in the doctrine. He's like, "You're getting a little ahead of us." And I said, "That's okay. I need to get the aviation branch, back out of fighting as teams of 2 aircraft and thinking about how we're gonna maneuver. How are we gonna be a maneuver force, and how are we gonna deal with large scale combat? Because being a scout weapons team or the team tactics piece, that will fall out of it. And I can still sustain our coin proficiency in doing that." So when I got back up here to CAC, I mean, it was there's lots of discussion about, hey, we've got to get moving on doctrine. 2015 kind of got us kicked off, and I was here when I was in CAC-T. I was the deputy at the time that General Perkins really drove kind of restructuring how our doctrine is, and the seminal document that drives everything we do is 3.0, and we needed a new 3.0. So I think probably the first person that I had in my office or one of the first decisions I made was with Colonel Creed, getting him on board as our doctrine chief, and moving out with how do we think about, and we'd become very capabilities based. Our doctrine was more focused from a capabilities perspective, and it was not threat focused. The doctrine, our best doctrine, I think that we had, was threat focused. When you look back in our history, where we defined a threat and we understood what that threat did, and it drove .mil PF. It defined the problem, and I don't believe our doctrine, since we'd come out of the Cold War, had really defined the problem adequately that we needed to solve. It defined a problem, and it really defined the problem that was in the Army's inbox, and it was not the range of problems that the Army needed to be able to deal with. So I think that, in a broad term, all of that rolled together was what was the impetus for, driving 3.0. And I didn't know how long I was going to be here in CAC. It could have been a year, it could have been 4 years. It ended up being 4 years, so I guess I got lots of redos. But So there was also a sense of urgency because I went down to Fort Rucker thinking I was going to be the CG down there for 2 or 3 years and moved up here about a year and a half later. So I felt a sense of urgency to get it moving because I knew the amount of work to get it done would take time, and we needed to be thorough, but we couldn't drag it out because for doctrine to drive changes in the professional military education, for it to down, for that capstone doctrine to drive the subordinate doctrine, to drive PME, to drive the combat training centers back to what they needed to be doing, we needed to get it out relatively quickly. And we were still, buying lots of counterinsurgency capabilities when in fact the counterinsurgency fight was starting to wane and the other threats were emerging. So I don't know if that answered your question, but hey, there's a long diatribe on.
But there was also, from our perspective, and me particularly as a new guy showing up, and that was the first thing in the inbox that we talked about, sir, was we had been getting, in a broad sense, very specific guidance that started with how CTC rotations were supposed to be from General Milley. And he was pretty outspoken, even in congressional testimony, about who the bad guys are and why those kinds of fights, which what we were working that whole peer, near peer threat. But the big idea was the thing that would be radically different in operations against Russia, China, and to a lesser extent, but similar, North Korea or Iran, was that they could do certain things to us that we were doing to other people with impunity for 20-something years. Yeah. And the idea that was a linkage to a concept that TRADOC was working on at the time was, if you can be contested in all domains, then that makes the nature of the fight very different. And so that combination of hearing what the big brain guys like General McMaster and some others were thinking about in TRADOC, and then the chiefs, he may not have ever called us on the phone and said something, but we knew what the intent was.
Absolutely. No, and I think Russia had gone into the Crimea, Ukraine. We'd looked at the Russian New Generation Warfare Study. There were China's building islands in the North China Sea. I mean, those were the things that were bubbling around the world. And even though we were still in both Afghanistan and Iraq, there were clear and present dangers that were on what some would still argue was a pretty distant horizon, because our assessment of Russia and China, there were a lot of people talking 2030, 2035, 2040. And when you look at the life cycle of anything in the Army, it takes you 7 or 8 years to build a new combat system, sometimes longer than that. It takes you 5 years to change PME, and it's not, you can change it that year, but, it takes about 5 years for enough people to get it to where, there's some continuity. You get a CTC rotation, once every 2 years. So your ability to change stuff very rapidly requires you to, if doctrine is driving a lot of that, it's one of the reasons why it became kind of the main effort, as I came out of the gate here for me as the commander, because that was going to be the spark that should light all of the fires. And having the chief on board, who frequently asked me for copies of 3.0. I'm not sure he ever read them, but I frequently talked to him about them. And, for him to pick up that mantle and drive that gave us the leverage to push it into really every piece of the Army that needed it, whether it was our total Army analysis of how we develop formations to, all the material developers. It became a lens that we looked through at a lot of things across the Army to say, well, hey, is that the right piece we need to be building, or is that the right way we need to develop a leader? Is that the way we need to be fighting our CTCs? It put the right lens on all of that. While also, and we were very deliberate, I think, in not turning a blind eye to the lessons that we'd learned over the last 15 or 18 years, because there were tremendous lessons that were very applicable and very important for us to bring into how we thought about large-scale combat, because our perspective of large-scale combat in 1987 is different than our perspective of large-scale combat right now. And it's informed, and it's better. It's much better. It's informed and educated by what we learned doing counterinsurgency.
The human nature of conflict and all
absolutely
of that.
The information piece of it, the necessity to consolidate gains of how do we transition back to a better form of competition. All of those things that were frankly, very big ideas in 3.0 were things that we'd learned. I think that's also another thing that's really important, is how we continue to learn. Are we able to adapt our doctrine with the right learning?
Well, we were blessed also by having a TRADOC commander in the person of General Perkins.
Absolutely.
Who
was also passionate about
he
doctrine.
was passionate about it, and then he was a quick study on understanding. So he didn't micromanage anything we were doing. He, hey, let me know what's the big things and what do you want me to advocate for.
Yep.
That allowed us to be left alone, I think, sir, and that was really important. when
Yeah,
you're
I mean,
doing
he gave very good, very concise, he epitomized the philosophy of mission command. There was a significant amount of trust, but I would tell you he also checked, and I think it was our responsibility to make sure that to maintain that trust, we had to inform up, and I think us engaging with the senior leadership was important for them because that they needed to drive that into the Army as an institution.
Well, and I joke around with what I used to do with Mike and Chuck all the time, and sometimes with you, but you didn't have to give any sort of really detailed guidance. In other words, we would have weekly touch points with you on stuff, but the things that we would work our way through weren't always just the big ideas. We could focus on getting the details right because, having been the bag man and up at TRADOC, being around General Perkins and being in the meetings for 2 years before coming out here, I already knew what you knew in terms of what the overall intent was, and so that you could talk to me without having to explain everything to it. And then the LSCO focus, I think, God takes care of fools and drunks, right? So I'm not sure which one I fit into in any particular day, but the spending 4 straight years in Korea and coming out as the Division G3, where you're doing 2 large-scale combat exercises a year with multiple iterations of each, plus your warfighters, I was very comfortable talking about the subject matter we were talking about. That doesn't mean we didn't all have to learn. There's a bunch of things to learn. But I think that it was almost like a perfect storm of right people in the right place at the right time to do something quickly that the Army needed. And it's not like thumping on a tread. It's more like luck, the way it worked out.
Well, and I mean, I think probably the funnest part of my job was I got to focus, pretty much just on warfighting and thinking about warfighting. And the sessions we would have in my office with my whiteboard, and y'all would save the scribbles that I put all over the whiteboards, the multiple. I ended up with like 4 whiteboards in my office by the time we were done, and most of them had like multiple pages to them. But but we had some great discussions to try to hash through the friction points or whatever a new idea would be to, how much we need to mature that or whether we got that right or not. Or when, as we staffed it and, there were people with questions or other ideas, we were able to work through that. So I think that was good.
So I've got this, you've got a 4-star who is absolutely, and TRADOC commander who is absolutely committed to the idea of letting the professionals do what they do best. And your career's worth of experience coming in saying we need to make a transition, and you've got a CADD director who's straddling the line of I know what TRADOC does, but I also know warfighting from a LSCO perspective in Korea. And then eventually somebody's got to put pen to paper and start typing so many samsters on keyboards. It's wonderful. So it's kind of like my question of what was the process and how did that work as far as did you allow airline battle to influence you, some of the language that you use? What came away from FSO? What did you choose to pick and put in?
Yeah, so I'll talk about what I think we did, and Mike will say what we actually did, right? But
in the beginning,
yeah. ... Yeah, exactly. And so, all right, first we had to be clear on what problem we were trying to solve. And so we used the Russian New Generation Warfare study that a lot of really smart people went and collected real-world stuff from. But we realized that even that by itself wasn't enough because we lived in a multipolar world. So the big thing we had to do is get what problem we were trying to solve, the Army forces would be asked to solve across this range of military operations. But we had to have an agreement about what we focused on. And so we got good guidance. You're going to focus on large-scale combat operations against peer threats. Well, who are the peer threats? Well, what did General Milley testify before open source in front of Congress? Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. Okay, got it. So that allows us to set things up. But what we asked the team to do, because writing doctrine is not just taking the existing thing and then saying, how can I make it better? That's part of it. But the other part is, when did we have a similar problem set in the past? Not the same, but a similar problem set. And let's go back with the Wayback Machine, because we have all these publications going back 100 years, and take a look about where we had the best language to address similar problems, and then use that as a point of departure, right? So if the doctrine written in the 70s and 80s was reviewed, and in some cases, at least in the 60s and 70s, you had people that actually commanded large formations in large-scale combat operations in the Second World War or Korea or Vietnam, and they approved that doctrine back then. It was probably pretty good, right? I mean, they were real subject matter experts who had done that. And then you could do the same thing with looking at stuff from Desert Storm and so forth. So the doctrine team goes back and does research and looks to cherry pick the best things that would be applicable, and then figuring out how to wicker them into the problem we're trying to solve now, so that it's not starting from a clean sheet. Because there's plenty of things that was in the previous 3.0. 3.0 had disappeared for 4 years. It disappeared in 2012 as rescinded, so we didn't actually have an FM capstone high tactics publication anymore. So this was a new start, and writing from scratch. And so, okay, we're not going to start from scratch. We're going to start and take the best stuff from the past, and then figure out, okay, so what's missing, what's new? And that gets to ideas like consolidate gains and some of these other things that were new. And a multi-domain appreciation of the operational environment, because you had this concept that was being developed simultaneously, and when we got guidance that said, hey, if there's bits of this concept that makes sense to use right now and the force can do it or it's useful, then put it in there. And so, there's a kind of an iteration process with people working on concepts. They send it to us to look at.
Well, I think that brings up an important point, though, as we go to the future. And we had this discussion because, we used to be on a timeline. I mean, we updated our doctrine based on a timeline. It was every 2 years, every 4 years, whatever. And I think what that forced was the conditions hadn't changed, the OE, what we were doing. There was not a bunch of big inputs. There's not a stimulus for the change other than time. And so you had people rewording or reworking or rebranding stuff that was frankly, and so we actually muddled and lost a few things in those times. So
we complicated it simple.
Yeah, we did. And so, one of the things I said is, look, we're not gonna go on a timeline. It's got to be purposeful on why we update or change our doctrine, And so we're not trying to write the same thing in different language. We're trying to actually think about the new parts of the problem we're solving and keep the goodness of things that we have. I mean, was it FS 1917 or 1918, 15, whatever it is? I mean, it's probably got the best description of mission command that I've...
1905.
1905, that's it. I mean, by far the best description of mission command. But there's a bunch of differences in mission command today than 1905, and so, how do we get the depth behind that and think about those things as opposed to, rebranding certain things that are almost iconic and just need to be left alone.
Well, and before we let Mike talk about how they actually really did it, the one thing I would throw out there is perfect example of evidence of what you just said of people, because we did it on timelines, we just continuously updated things, and most people, because they don't read doctrine every day, they'll just go with what they already know. And so the words, the descriptions, the definitions have changed, but the meaning hadn't changed to them, and it was less of an incentive for you to pay close attention to it, because all they're doing is rewording this thing that we used to do, and we're just going to call it that. And so the last 3 years, our tactics division has gone back and taken all of the tactical terms and all these ideas And not only did we realize that in different books and different places and different communities, the same words meant different things, but they actually, on their own, they showed some pretty good initiative. They took the definitions of things from like 1995 to 2000, and then looked at the different iterations of the definitions. And you know what happened? And each time we updated the definitions of most of our terms, we made them longer. Yeah. And in no case were they better. Yeah. In any time. And so that's allowed us to do some other things here once we get that stuff straight, right? That we don't have to. Yeah, or
we would take a definition and try to come up with a new term for it.
Because somebody had an idea.
An existing definition, but hey, this word sounds better to describe that. Those are the kind of things that are not helpful in doctrine. And I think based on time and not having something, a stimulus to drive it, whether we've changed, we have a national defense strategy change, we have a threat change, whatever it may be, those are the things that spur very thoughtful, innovative discussion and development of doctrine. But if you put it on a timeline or if it's a tasker, you're going to end up with stuff just getting reworded and frankly becoming less clear and less concise.
Well, I mean, it happened once a week. During the 4 years you were in command here, at least once a week, we would have that situation where something wasn't new, but it was new to the person that was asking the question.
Yeah.
So I just came up with this good idea. Well, okay.
It's in our doctrine.
Yeah, we got that already. And the number of phone calls that you would field from people saying, we need doctrine to do this, and then you would call down there and say, don't we have doctrine to do this? And we'd send it to them. It was always interesting. Some people would say thank you, and some people didn't always even acknowledge that, oops, I probably should have known that already. But yeah, I mean, there's a doctor no piece of this that you're like, no, stop, please. We don't need to confuse people. Every time you change something, it has this impact across the WPF and PMA and all the rest.
Hey, I'll be quick on the sausage making of the writing team. And so really want to highlight is just CADD. The Combined Arms Doctrine Directorate is a unique place. It's at Fort Leavenworth. We write here in CADD, Combined Arms Doctrine, generally thinking brigade and above. And so the people you get in here are top-notch people, and they're senior. And so when a lot of these questions came up, and it's a combination of military and civilian, and so that makes a great team. And so when you look around, you got to pick someone, you got to pick a team, and they're either got green suits on or they're civilians. And something we're saying, well, who has kind of actually experienced some of the 1986, the Desert Storms, etc. Well, on that team we had for FM30, there was like 3 Desert Storm veterans that were on it, right? There was guys that lived on the Fulda Gap, but it's not the same, but you have some resident experience that was able to help with that. Plus you got folks that were out there in the field that had the green suit on, that had that experience. And when you combine that team together, that makes for better writing. And so you can have top-down guidance. You can look historically. And then we're on Fort Leavenworth. We've got all this resource available. You got the college. You got MCTP. You got CALL, right? And all these resources that can help you.
TRISA or TRADOC G2.
Oh,
looking at the intel piece.
And so, you got to put pen to paper, but it's like forming the team. And then trust that the team members are going to kind of do your guidance, and then write the book. And then of course the best thing is we staff it to the Army for everyone to get another look at it. Then we clean it up again, and that's not a bad book. And that's kind of how we make sausage around here.
Well, but the other thing is, and I think this gets to your earlier point. So we didn't over delegate, right? I would tell you that from our perspective, and I know you had conversations with commandants and branch chiefs and COE commanders over time, but we had, outside of counterinsurgency doctrine, which was a big, massive team effort here, right, led in 2006 or 5 and 6, we kind of like delegated stuff down. Hey, doctrine guys, update this stuff, and I'm not sure who read it, but it goes up and it gets approved, and it was almost like the 3-star can delegate to the 2-star, delegates to 1-star, who delegates to the GS-12, who writes the book, and then nobody reads it and it goes back up, right? That's excessive delegation, I think, because you really need to have people, the most experienced people, look at stuff. I think when we did this, it was that iteration of, I trust that you're going to write it, I'm delegating you to this, but I'm interested enough in that you're going to share it with Chuck Schrankel. He's going to murder a bird. Red pen your thing. You're going to send it to me. I red pen your stuff. You fix it. It comes back to me. I send it to you. You red pen the heck out of it. It comes back down. We argue about stuff back and forth. Then I argue with you guys back and forth. And there was the right level of engagement, even if it drove you guys nuts sometimes. But I mean, it was a kind of a thing of beauty to participate in, because you always felt like you had the top cover to take a chance and throw something out there, because once you said, yeah, that's good, that became the thing. And we could move on to the next thing. We weren't relitigating things over and over again because we didn't have anybody to talk to.
Yeah, I mean, my wife she knew what chapters I was working on. So
did mine.
Yeah, it was that was my weekend work, but it was, I learned a ton though as I was doing it. It helped me really think more clearly about the problem. And I think the discussions that we had, although there were a lot of them, it seemed like, but, just, hey, let's huddle up and spend 3 hours in my office going over this.
Well, people understand that there's work that has to get done.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And it's not just the author or the authors of the chapters that do the work. I mean, the other people need to be involved in the work if you want to get it right. And I don't know, I'll defer to Mike, but I think there's some other bits and pieces of that experience that, in terms of figuring out where you get the material, to, okay, here's the new idea, what do we get after? The whole Consolidate Gains, for example, was a research project.
Yeah.
And it was a history thing.
We put some stuff in this manual that we'd kind of walked away from in previous, vignettes and quotes, which I thought helped contextualize it even better. And it helped. It's sort of a level of validation, and I spent as much time reading and hammering back on the vignettes and going, hey, let's make sure this is right, because I'm not so sure that or that. Let's go back in and do some more research on it, because we do have a tendency to, if you're not checking your traps, every historian's got a different perspective on. So I want to try to get the more ground truth on, these things. Yeah, obviously, a quote from Clausewitz or Jomini was pretty easy to make sure we got right, but some of the vignettes that we had, there were, it was written towards not necessarily the purpose for the vignette being in there. So let's go back and do that one doesn't fit. Okay, well, let's find another one. But I think they helped bring context and a level of visualization, and like I said, experiential learning is always important. And if somebody has experience in something, whether they've read about it or they've actually experienced it, or they know that other people have experienced it, I think it helps them frame things better in their mind, and it does provide some level of validation of the thought, which is important.
So 2017 hits, and it's like the October timeframe, and all of a sudden the glossy printed editions come out. Folks are excited about reading the new version of FM30. I was so excited I literally stole like the colorized copy off of Nate Springer's desk.
Person that was, I think. So you're an exception. No.
So what were some of the criticisms from the force when it came out? Was there any pushback?
I think when you there always is. I mean, when you put doctrine out, I mean, I think a couple of the big things were, hey, we're walking away from what we've been doing for the last 15 years. And when I went back in and said, hey, look, consolidation of gains, when we think about that it's a form of exploitation, and the fact that, we are making, the temporary permanent, that we learned that over the last 15 years of how important that is, and that it's got to be considered, before, during, and after, through the entire continuum of the conflict, that how we get after doing that, or the fact that we are still talking in the doctrine about how we stabilize the environment. There were the joint aspect. I mean, when we, I think that was kind of as we went from full spectrum operations to unified land operations, that was really our nod to the joint force in a much more deliberate way, even though full spectrum operations we were embedded with joint, but it was our overt acknowledgement that, as one of the unified action partners, that, every fight is going to be a joint fight. That the jointness that we learned the good pieces of the jointness and the bad pieces. That the fact that we were over reliant on Air Force fires at the expense of surface to surface fires, in a contested environment. Although the Air Force still plays a critical role to any success that the Army is going to have on the battlefield. But just a better understanding of how that jointness should work. Those were things that we learned. SOF integration, the role of SOF in large-scale combat operations. That, you can look back, there was very little mention, if any mention of that in any of our previous, operational manuals that provided any kind of context. And those were things that we learned. National power and, how national power came to bear on the battlefield and what the Army's role was within the joint force. I think those were all things that we'd learned. And really, I think to a degree, mission command and initiative and being able to operate decentralized. Those were things that, early in the conflict in Iraq and Afghanistan, I think the mission command philosophy and the ability for us to operate in very small units dispersed across very, very large, vast areas with multiple complex problems that we were dealing with, those were all things that we learned that rolled into that doctrine. So I would say that we probably, and as I talked to that, and in fact we had several think tanks accuse us of walking away from that. And when we responded back with those things and kind of showed them to them, in fact there was a study done, there was actually an acknowledgement back that actually the Army did learn a lot over the last, and they've incorporated that in the doctrine. So I think that was probably one of the big pushback items. I think most of the other times that we got pushback was from page turning, flipping, reading a title, looking for the 3 or 4 buzzwords, and then not reading the narrative behind it. And I think that was kind of a change. And one of the reasons why 3.0 got a little bit bigger than probably we intended it to be was we tried to put, my guidance was to put more of a narrative in it so people could, I wanted to get away from, bulletized checklists and, things like that, and having more of an explanatory narrative that helped people understand what the definition meant in context to that fight. And where we would get pushback, it might be somebody extracting a sentence, taking it at face value, not seeing all the explanatory language, and when I would send them that back, it would be like, okay, you guys got it. And I think probably the last one, and Rich, I'm sure as you guys went through the CRM and stuff, you can probably remember a lot more. There was this, because we were in the throes of thinking about a new concept, and it had evolved, and it started to evolve to multi-domain operations at that time. And, and the guidance that I gave, because, concepts are, what we want to be able to do, and doctrine is what we can do. And there's got to be a balance between, doctrine needs to drive how we equip our force and how we man our force and but it can't be so revolutionary that when you put it out in the force, you can't do it for 10 years because you're waiting on, the Army to get its stuff together. So you got to get a balance there. But I did want to push the envelope a little bit, because a lot of the discussion at the joint level there was a recognition now that, hey, we needed to think differently about warfighting. And there were some concepts coming out of the joint staff that were very service-centric and pretty myopic on how they were defining the national problem, and try to get that conversation a little broader of, that we've got these 4 problems that are out there, and every service has a role and has a different role in each one of them, and how the Army's going to deal with that. I think, so we did incorporate as much of the multi-domain concept, and it was really a 100-page concept at that time. It had not been through a lot of rigorous experimentation and other stuff, but there were some thoughtful ideas in there that were going to shape how we were going to think about the future. So for 3.0 to be something that we could do today, but also would help guide us to modernization, guide us to help us, drive how we change the Army. Because, with TAA, we're looking 6-7 years in advance, and weapon systems we're looking that far to make it enough, keeping a balance to where we could still do it, but it would see far enough forward that we could see, what the next 2 or 3 steps are. It wasn't just about what was in the inbox. It was about how we needed to get to what was going to be in our inbox in 5, 10, 15 years. So I don't know, Richard, you or Mike got...
Yeah, so I'll leave
I think consolidation of gains was the other one that was a big.
Yes, sir. So I would throw two overriding factors that drove criticism, and we actually appreciate criticism because it sharpens your argument. And oh, by the way, if they're right about something, and in some cases they were, then it allows you to fix some things the next time you give it a try. The first was FM30 with the focus on large-scale combat operation against peer threats required a cultural shift across the Army. And so because it required a cultural shift, that operational environment slide that we still use, that I briefed the other day, the bulk of the people who were reading the book for the first time, the bulk of their experience was since 2003. I mean, the Army's a young organization, and 85% of the population is under 40, and maybe higher than that. So you are telling them things that are new, that it's the first read you're not going to necessarily absorb, and you have trouble visualizing. So that's one. And then the second piece was we were getting a lot of criticism from people that didn't read it. Yeah. They saw a slide pitch or whatever, and they said, well, how come we didn't address this? Well, because it's a PowerPoint briefing, and we can't put everything in the book in the PowerPoint.
They'd flip to the logic chart and then go, well, hey, in your logic chart, it doesn't say anything about,
civil affairs.
Right. Well, okay, it's a logic chart. So, no, I think, and again, it gets back to that intellectual laziness that I talked about. And frankly, I probably had, ruffled a lot of feathers because, when I would get that response, I'm like, don't be intellectually lazy. Read the manual, come back and line by line tell me what you don't think is right, because I've read it probably 30 times. The number of versions that I sent back over here and scribble outs, and like I'd go back and look at version 1. Well, I changed this last time, and now I'm going back to what they originally said. Damn it! And I went through like 3 iterations, but it was a part of the whole thinking process. And
so the other criticism, sir, though, is so you touched on the consolidate gains. What is this? Why are we doing this? What does this mean? You remember the conversation with General McKiernan about that once we explained it to him, he actually became a great champion of that with the division and corps commanders, when at first it came across as a criticism.
Yeah, and with General Abrams. General Abrams had concerns, and I think being the great armored warfare leader that he is, I think when we contextualize it, that it's a form of exploitation. He goes, I get it. Right. Because, hey, I'm exploiting the success that I've had.
But you talked about the walking away thing. I did probably 300 engagements across, all 3 components in the force over the last 4 or 5 years, and you always get somebody that says, oh, well, you're walking away from all this. I said, we haven't walked away from anything. All those books are still there. In fact, we continue to revise them. We're talking about one particular publication with a specific focus, but all these other things that you're talking about, particularly nowadays with that competition, crisis, conflict, we used to use the Army strategic roles, it's in there. Just read it. So that's one. The length of the book was another one. It was 384 pages, I think. Yeah. But there was a reason for that. Yeah. And there was 150 of those pages probably were based on 2 chapters. One, which was to educate the force about what was in the Army besides BCTs, right, and what those echelons above brigade are responsible for, which we hadn't put in the previous doctrine for a long time. And then the other was a bunch of very basic blocking and tackling tactics stuff that we had to put in there because it wasn't right in the other books.
Correct.
All of which we can pull out, and we are pulling out of the next book. And then the last one that used to drive us to the craziest was the operational framework. Yeah. And because you had a bunch of people who grew up being taught that counterinsurgency was the most complex form, the PhD level of warfare, and everything's complex, and so you guys are oversimplifying by putting this thing, and you're talking about linear operations. And so, no, we're not talking about linear operations, but when you put lines on a piece of paper, it's going to look linear. It's 2-dimensional. Read what we're saying. It's a mental framework for the operations you conduct. And the words linear do not once appear in 384 pages.
Well, it's funny now that since we've transitioned the combat training centers, the Mission Command Training Program, the National Training Center, JRTC, JMRC, and our COCOM and ASCC Theater Army level exercises have shifted back to how we fight, a pure threat. The argument of, hey, we've gone from some, PhD level warfighting down to, something that's much more linear and rote, everybody realizes, wow, we were pretty wrong about thinking that way, because, this is a much more difficult fight, much more complex fight. There are so many more variables and risks and requirements, and the amount of intellectual and technical knowledge and skills that you've got to have at much lower grades to be able to be successful in this is much more apparent now than it was, when we first started writing the doctrine. So as they've started to train and experience it, they're realizing that, it's not that counterinsurgency is easy, it's just, it's different, and at each one of the echelons, the tactics piece of it is at the company and platoon level with, brigades doing almost operational level stuff. Divisions certainly doing operational stuff. Corps doing operational to theater level or strategic level stuff. That portion of it is complicated because, and complex, because they've got to they're dealing with, State Department entities, they're dealing with non-governmental organizations, there's a lot of soft interaction, but it's all fairly narrow interaction. And when you start to get into large-scale combat, all of that's still present. But it's at a much more complex and intense level, and just the tempo and violence that's involved in large-scale combat and the risk. I think now the Army has a much greater appreciation for just how hard it is to stay ready for this type of fight, and what it takes from a combined arms team perspective, and that all of the warfighting functions have to be synchronized and integrated. And that
your branch expertise is important.
Branch expertise.
That's why we have branches. I mean,
Exactly.
That was one of the things that that subject
the
matter.
relevance
expertise.
of some of the branches, that really were subjugated to doing something other than they were trained for. The proficiency of a field artilleryman or a chemical officer or a signal officer is very different in this kind of fight. I mean, much more relevant and needed than maybe in a counterinsurgency fight.
So, gentlemen, last thing, you're 5 years removed from this book and the process that you went through to try and write it. So what now, with all of that experience, do you see as a gap that you wish you could have addressed, and how should we address it, or how, more importantly, should Lieutenant Colonel Eric Gilgey's team toiling away on the current edition of FM30, how should they address it?
Well, I think the one thing that I think's been a blessing, and it goes back to incorporating as much of initially the multi-domain battle, now multi-domain operations concept into the rest of our doctrine following this version of 3.0 that came out in October of 2017. Acts as a bridging strategy as we work to the new one. A lot of the ideas that are in the new one are already resident in our field manuals, our Army doctrinal publications, and a lot of our ATPs, because we've updated 220 odd books based on a focus primarily, not in every case, but primarily on large-scale combat operations and a multi-domain approach to seeing yourself, seeing the threat, and understanding the operational environment. And so we've been doing that for 4 odd years now, and that makes it a little bit easier for us to focus down. And then I already talked, we got the tactics book straight, we got all these other things sorted out now that allows Eric's team to focus specifically on conducting operations at echelons above brigade against a China or a Russia or Iran or North Korea in the context of those specific operational environments. Whereas we tended to be more basic blocking and tackling and not as focused on that bigger, you mentioned it, but it could get lost in the length of the book. And that allows us to write a book that's at least 100 pages shorter, and really focused on the kinds of things you're seeing happen in real world in Ukraine right now. And I think after what we've seen happening in Ukraine right now, that we're on the right track. And that makes us feel good that we're not getting it largely wrong. We'll see how things turn out.
Yeah, I think the operations that are currently, that happened in Ukraine and are happening in Ukraine right now validate much of the concerns that this doctrine gets after.
Yes, sir. And our understanding of the OE.
Yeah, and it helps us validate, and we're also going to learn from this too. I think to get to your point earlier, I think what ultimately flowed out of, FM30 was about how do we change the Army the right way to be able to deal with the right problems. The National Defense Strategy was not out when we released it. It was ahead of a lot of things. And we were like up on the balls of our feet that we might have to make some change, like some immediate changes to 3.0 if the National Defense Strategy went somewhere else. I think, fortunately, and I don't know that 3.0, I'm sure all the conversations that went on around stuff helped shape things, but the good news is that we were a little ahead, but we didn't have to make a lot of changes. But to me, as I look back, one of the key things that came out later, really in 2019, was the gap study, the LSCO gap study. And as I look back at that, I wish I would have done that earlier as the CAC commander. And it probably would have been something that would have been appropriate to almost do simultaneous with the doctrine, because we're addressing gaps. So we went back and we did this gap assessment based on the doctrine and how we're going to fight and the OE. And I think we could have done those at the same time and started this change in the Army earlier. Although history will say whether we were too late or just in time. But I think looking back at that, so I think there's another. As we refine MDO and we finish this manual up, we need to probably take a quick look at the gap study that we did and see if there's any new gaps or adjustments we need to make, and how that drives Army processes to modernize and update the formation.
But that gap study did give us a more detailed problem set to write against in the current 3.0.
Absolutely.
So we can acknowledge those.
Yeah,
things
there's almost a cycle there, and I think that's
and it's probably time that we do another one here in Canada.
And I think the learning piece of China is different today than it was when we wrote the 2017. They've more rapidly evolved than we thought they were. I think the fact that we're getting after the ATPs that describe their military doctrine is helpful. So I think there's a lot of really good things in place now that we didn't necessarily have in place when we wrote the original 3.0 that are gonna help. But looking back at it, I think the only if I could rewind the tape and go, I would change this one thing or take this one thing out, I think it would be probably the consolidation area, the operational framework. That one, looking back at it in rear operations, we sometimes you're predisposed. You don't want to use a particular term because it has some sort of emotional level with it, and that was one for me that
and everybody else.
And everybody else. I mean, so there's some, and I think you got to pay particular attention to that you don't get any bias towards a particular description or something for no good reason. There's got to be some good reason behind it. And again, it gets back to renaming things that maybe you don't need to rename. That's probably one that I think that probably caused confusion, between the support area command post, rear area operations, the support area, the relationship, all of those things, and consolidation of gains in the consolidation area. What we thought was a neat and tidy solution to it, and at the time it made perfect sense from a logical perspective. Looking back at it, it was the thing that probably became the one thing that boiled and continued to boil with the manual. Everything else, I think, everybody was like, yeah, all on board, it's good, it's driving all the right stuff, but we've got problems with this. If I could go back and excise that little piece out of it, that would have been the thing, and it's been excised out of this one, so that's good.
Well, but the bigger ideas, or the reason why we could comfortably move on, was that the whole importance of consolidating gains was accepted by the force, even though we didn't describe things as clearly or with as much utility maybe as people would use. And now that set us free to go and do.
Well, and we made the mistake, much like we made the mistake with Mission Command of it having multiple definitions. That it's a philosophy, it's how we command and control. It is command and control. but we don't do command and control. I mean, that whole thing, that was some baggage. Now I think we've got it in the right place about it not being a warfighting function, that it is our philosophy for how we command and control. I think we've got that in the right place.
But 3.0 set us free to do that.
Yeah, but consolidation of gains, the concept was exactly right and was the right lesson we learned. It's when we put a piece of the operational framework and said we're going to have a consolidation area. Right. My idea, my bad.
I think, we were fishing for, that was a whiteboard session of
yeah,
fishing.
It was, and I can remember it to this day. And it was kind of like, we thought we were so smart. That was the one that, as I look back at it, caused the most difficulty for the Army to understand. But what it did was it really forced our culture to think about the rear area and the level of importance that it should be. So in fact, it may have been genius. Who knows? But because the rear area, when I was growing up, was much of an afterthought, and the fact that we tried to reshape it to be something of the importance that it was, and the fact that you were going to be doing combat tasks back there, that discussion went on in the Army. We just didn't like the language, and so changing the language, I think now we've probably got the Army in a better place with thinking about the importance of how we sustain and how we drive operational reach in the force and how we protect ourselves, and what's going to be this this very dynamic fight through the depth of the operational framework. So maybe history will say that it was good that it happened, but if I could excise it right now, I probably would have went back and taken it out, because
it was our version of active defense, right? So
yeah,
it gave you something to work through.
Roger.
I'll tell you the other big positive impact I think that the books had was it was not just the recognition that specific branch expertise is important to a joint and combined arms approach to operations. It's more than important, it's critical. If you show up and you're supposed to be representing, because warfighting functions can sometimes be too broad. I mean, there's a branch expertise, and the application may be in support of one warfighting function or maybe another or multiple. That was big, but I think the second and third order effect, if you remember, it was a reemphasis and resurgence of people paying attention to sustainment. And that was probably, I think that it may have been the most critical outcome, other than fixing the mission command debacle. But this emphasis that math matters, that sustainment's got to be central to your operational approach and the operational art, and that we need to pay attention to it. There's got to be champions for sustainment in the other communities, and it can't just be sustainers trying to figure this all out by themselves.
No, and I think your point on the branch specific is really an important point that many may not think about. And frankly, I hadn't drawn the linkage until just this discussion. But many of our MOSs, and branches that were not central to the fight, field artillery, chemical, engineers to a large degree, MPs to some degree. I mean, when one of the air defense, when one of those officers, NCOs, soldiers showed up in your formation, you were more concerned about what their experience was in COIN and what they, what are you good at? Well, hey, sir, I spent all this time patrolling. Okay, good. But nobody was concerned about, hey, are you proficient as an air defender? Or are you proficient as a field artilleryman? And now the expertise is when you walk in the door, you look at their branch, and you have an expectation that field artillery officer, knows, the things you need for accurate and predicted fires. They can, help you develop the right kind of fire plan. They know how to build a fast P. They understand weapons ranges, weapons effects. They understand targeting. They understand joint targeting. That there's an expectation when that branch walks in. There was not that expectation before. It's like, can you do what we're doing in COIN, which is not any of that stuff specific to your branch. So I think that's been good, and there's a resurgence in a technical and professional level of skills and knowledge that our leaders and our soldiers have to have for large-scale combat that is branch-specific. And some branches that were, frankly, less important in the COIN fight are of the utmost importance in large-scale combat. And we've got to rebuild some of that because, experience and and what they've been doing and the iterations that they've done, they haven't had as much practice. So that's our road ahead.
The General Perkins called it an adequate level of parochialism for your.
Yeah.
Well, gentlemen, that wraps up my questions. Have you got any other great insights or advice you want to leave the audience with before we depart for the day?
Mike?
Okay, I'll say one thing. I think Eric's team's in good shape. We took a real good stab at this in 2017, and since then, we've had 4.5 years, 5 years to learn. Folks have exercised it in the training centers. They have done it in operations. We have a chance, as you said, Mr. Cree, to fix some of our doctrine. We got a 394 now that's updated on our echelons from division up through theater army. So we got a better body of knowledge. We got more experience, and we got a whole new team now of smart folks that now can take what we did in 2017 and make it better for this next version that's coming out.
I don't think I have anything to add. It's been real good catching up, sir, and reliving the good old days, and remembering how much work actually was involved with all those whiteboards. And thank God they invented digital cameras so we could take pictures of that stuff, because trying to make your own sketches was tough. But we really appreciate you being here.
Well, no, it's been fun, and I've enjoyed it, and I appreciate you asking me to do this. You get lots of trinkets as you progress through your career in the Army. There's going away gifts and all that stuff, and when you leave a pretty large command, lots of people want to give you lots of different things. And I told everybody, give me a book so I can learn something. And but I would tell you the out of all the really cool colors and flags that I've got, on my walls and stuff, I think the thing that I, no kidding, cherish the most is a 50 cal bottle opener that says I was the FM30 writing team. And that meant more to me to get that than I think any other thing I got while I was in the Army. And so I learned a ton while we were doing this and during my time as a CADD commander. And I continue to learn now as a senior mentor. And it's why I was glad to be able to come up here today and kind of get caught up on where we're going and how we're thinking about the future. And I appreciate the opportunity to comment on the new 3.0. But, as I said, that the Army can only change in the right way through its Combat Training Center program, which is underpinned by really good doctrine. You can write really good doctrine, but if you don't have the stimulus to drive the change, which to me, that's our combat training centers or actual combat. Those are the two kind of crucible things that help drive the experiential relevance of that down in our force. But that doesn't mean that you can just go to a combat training center and think that you're going to get infused with doctrine. They're all doctrinally based, but you got to read and understand and think about our doctrine. And I think it's important. Because it's not prescriptive, it's descriptive, and it helps us think about problem solving and how we need to solve problems. And if you understand and can contextualize how our doctrine is written, it will also help you better define new problems that are emerging. And our nation is gonna constantly face new problems. It may be that the flag may be the same, the leader of the problem may be the same, but they're constantly evolving. The threats are constantly evolving. If we talk about seeing ourselves, seeing the enemy, and seeing the terrain, those things all change. The enemy's going to continue to adapt to what we're doing. We've got to continue to adapt. We've got to better appreciate the terrain, and that terrain is, the human terrain that is out there. The cognitive piece of war fighting, the temporal piece of that war fighting, the physical attributes that are out there. So continue to understand those and think about them, and then putting them into action at the combat training centers and in combat is how we continue to develop, the great leaders that need to have the initiative and be able to take the right and appropriate level of risk on the battlefield to seize and exploit, those opportunities that are going to be very fleeting in this kind of fight. So thanks for everything you and the CADD team continue to do. It's not a huge team, but it has a huge impact on our Army and the Joint Force. And I think I'll dismount with that. The thing that I appreciate probably most when I was here at CAC was how intertwined we are with the other services and the other nations out there, our partners, and the interactions that this team, you're probably our most joint and combined team that we have, because you are the tentacles, the intellectual tentacles that reach out and connect us with our joint partners, our interagency partners, and our multinational partners. And the complexities the world faces are going to be problems that are going to require us to do it not alone as an Army, certainly not alone as a nation. So y'all are a big part of that, and thanks for all the work that each of you do every day. It means a lot, and our Army owes you a great debt, and I do too. So thank you.
In getting ready for this podcast, I actually went back to the history books for some context. Along with the 2017 edition of FM30, I dug all the way back to 2008, 2001, along with the 1993-86 editions of FM 105. I even went back to the 1905 FSR, the Field Service Regulation. You can find these held at the Army Central Repository. You can also find copies throughout the internet. The 2017 transition to LSCO in FM30 was marked by also a really deep well of articles and papers. To craft some of the questions, I ended up starting with meeting the challenge of large-scale combat operations today and tomorrow, which was penned by Lieutenant General Lundy in September 2018 in Military Review. He also followed it up with 3 perspectives on consolidating gains, which was written by Lieutenant General Lundy, Mr. Creed, who was Colonel Creed at the time, and Colonels Nate Springer and Scott Pence in September 2018, also published with Military Review. What really drove a lot of the questions was looking back on some of the articles that came from a younger generation and from different voices. Large-Scale Combat Operations, How the Army Can Get Its Groove Back by Major James King was found in Modern Warfare Institute's 2018 June online edition. And also the article that I mentioned previously by David Barno and Nora Ben-Sahel, that's U.S. Military's Dangerous Embedded Assumptions, which was published in the War on the Rocks in April 2018. And then, where is the... There it is. Breaking Doctrine is a team effort. Without the crew and Special Doctrine Division here at CADD, we wouldn't be able to bring you this show. Our production is coordinated by Mr. Ted Crisco, and our editing and sound is provided by the man for all seasons, Captain Wyatt Harper, who you can also catch in our popular MDMP Doctrine Digest series on YouTube. And we'd like to thank you, our listeners, for joining us today. Please don't forget to subscribe to either Google or Apple Podcasts, and follow us on social media at U.S. Army Doctrine to get updates on new podcasts, our Doctrine Digest videos, and also publications. Finally, the views and opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the official position of the United States Army, the U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command, or the Combined Arms Center. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Nikki Dean, and Colonel Springer, I still have your copy of FM30, if you want it back. This has been Breaking Doctrine.